Hi, everyone, and welcome to week 1 of the Great Community Group Experiment. We are so glad that you decided to join us. We're going to have 3 of these videos representing this sermon series where we are looking at big potential. And so Pastor Keith and I are going to kind of go back and forth and discuss what it looks like to have big potential as we break down the sermon series week by week. To get started, if you haven't done so in your group, we want you to check in, get to know each other. This is, for many of you, the first time you've even met. So make sure you know each other's names and life stage and work situation or family situation. Maybe go over some highs and lows for the last week. So if you haven't done that yet, now is a great time to pause this video and do that as a group. If you've already done that as a group, if you've already checked in, then let's dive into our lesson, week 1 of our Big Potential sermon series, where we're looking at growth. And when we look at growth, we have a definition for spiritual transformation, and that definition that Pastor Keith shared with us is God lovingly changing our thoughts, feelings, and actions to resemble Jesus in community for the good of the world. And so with that definition, you broke down how we tease that out at Springcreek through the 3 words, grow, connect, and serve. And with grow, that one's love God. Mm-hmm. And with connect, that is love one another. And with serve, that is love your neighbor. And so we're breaking this down into love. Our focus the first week is grow. So as we look at grow, before we look at what does it look like to grow? How do I grow closer to God? How do I grow as a Christian? You brought up 3 unhealthy ways of spirituality, unhealthy ways of growth. And they were to feed the mind, feel the experience, and find your way. So what does that look like to practice those unhealthy areas of growth?
Well, I think that for me personally, I've experienced all of them. And mainly the first, the feed the mind, it kind of is a downside of going to seminary. In seminary, they just do this information dump into your head, and you get this idea that spiritual growth is all about the transference of that information. So sometimes you can go to church and it feels like a very academic exercise. It's all about what you know. It all stays in the head. The problem is many times what's really broken in our life maybe has to do with our emotions, that we're really not feeling, expressing those things. And sometimes even it's, our behavior is completely out of sync with what we know to be true. So that's one thing. And I've experienced probably that the most. But there's also those churches that are just totally into the experience of the thing. Now this can be any church, but it tends to be kind of the charismatic problem, where you see churches like the Assembly of God, the Pentecostal Church, Foursquare, and just, independent charismatics that are all into the experience of the thing. But sometimes you can find some really aberrant, some really out of line doctrines, some teaching in those churches where their experience of the Lord and what they have in worship seems to override what the scriptures actually teach. So that's its own kind of problem. And then probably mostly within fundamentalism, you find the last kind of unhealthy spirituality where everything is about the outward conformity. It's about what we do. Mm. And so we benchmark people by what they do. And these can be kind of like I alluded to in the last part of the message. It can be those things that are very outward, highly superficial, and really not indicative of true spiritual growth. But those are kind of the spheres I was envisioning, that we have these different areas and different exposures, especially if you've had any exposure in church, where that maybe a church was out of balance in how they were addressing human personality.
Yeah, so it's this 3-part of being overly intellectual, putting too much focus on that, or being overly emotional, focusing too much on that, or overly legalistic in a way, or you have to follow these 6 steps all the time the right way.
Right.
So right now we're going to pause and put a question up on the screen, and that question is, what are the ways that you get caught up in unhealthy pursuit of growth? Would you find yourself being overly intellectual, overly emotional, and overly legalistic? Or do you need to feed your mind, feel the experience, or find your way, as Keith said? So if you'll pause the video right here, we'll pop the question up for you guys to discuss as a group. Hope you enjoyed discussing that question. As we jump into the next part, we looked at this is what it doesn't mean to grow, Now we want to look at what it does mean to grow. And Jesus gave us a priority, as Pastor Keith quoted in Luke chapter 10. He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind. Jesus made this our priority in growth. That's the very first thing we should do. That's the most important commandment, as he said. And so we should focus on that first, what it looks like to love with all of our heart, with all our soul, with all our strength, and with all our mind. So since it's a big deal, we should kind of look at how do we do that? What does it look like? And you mentioned 3 catalysts or 3 big changes or shifts or actions that happen for us to growth. And it's from solitude to community to ministry. So we grow out of that solitude into community, into actually doing ministry. Can you tease that out for us and what that looks like?
Sure. Of course, we saw that was the pattern of Christ. And this is why churches, around the world, really consider these 3 areas the primary ways that God is going to grow us and be catalytic in the change and transformation that needs to happen in our soul. I do believe that everything, just like with Jesus, begins with seeking God individually, privately. That we really need to have a relationship with him. And that can be just really very different depending even on your personality. Some people are more into spiritual disciplines like being in the Word. Others are more into meditation. My personal discipline I love the most is prayer walking. Just going out and having no agenda and saying, God, I'm a present to you and I want to hear from you. But that's the priority, and that's something we have to do every day. We really want to seek God, make a priority, push back life to create space for him to do in us what needs to happen. The next thing we need is a community, like really what you're experiencing tonight in your group or this morning in your group, whatever time of the day you happen to be meeting. This group is an opportunity for you to get out of yourself and connect with other believers. That experience in and of itself is so life-changing because we see Christ so clearly in our brothers and sisters, and often we're exposed to our own growing edge in community because things come to the surface in relationship that just don't happen when we're all alone. So it can be a really wonderful catalyst for growth, either showing us our growing edge, what we're challenged by, what we're having to face, or the encouragement that we need just from our brothers and sisters who are there for us and praying for us. The third thing, though, is after I've spent this time with God, and I make that a daily kind of pursuit, and I make time in my schedule for my community, which for many of us ends up being a weekly kind of experience. But then there is service, which my whole life is obviously about service. It's about loving my neighbors. I love myself, and I can express that on the job. I can do that in next gen ministry. I can do that as a greeter. I can do that in running tech and sound. It doesn't matter. If I find an expression that fits really with who God has made me to be, and I begin to live that out, what I discover is I need all 3. That's the main point. I need all 3. One is not going to do it. There is no Christian that says, it's just me and Jesus and we got our own thing going. No, you got an imbalanced thing going if that's the case. You really do need community, and you need opportunities to give out of what you're receiving from God. And so those are the 3 catalysts, and I think that's how they work out in most of our lives. A lot of time with God, a weekly kind of experience, or more often with community, and then the opportunities to serve, which can happen throughout the day, and even specialized ministries that may happen only once a week or once a month.
I think these are good signifiers of growth to see that you're moving beyond just myself, just my personal growth with Jesus, into letting others speak into that, but also speaking into others. Because I'm really good at, I can lie to myself or only address the easy things that I want to deal with and hide the rest. So we as a group right now, we want you to pause and discuss what this looks like for you guys on the spectrum. Where do you find yourself? Are you focusing just on you and God? Are you focusing on just your community? Are you moving beyond personal time and growing into, please speak into my life, or I'm going to speak into yours? Or are you serving others as well? And it should be a cyclical thing where you are constantly repeating this. And so we're going to pause and put this question up on the screen. Where do you find yourself in this growth spectrum? And maybe you don't find yourself on it at all, and discuss that. You're exploring God and who he is, or what that looks like in your life. What does that next step look like? Yeah. So let's pause right here and discuss that question. I hope you enjoyed the discussion on that part. Now we're moving beyond what it looks like to grow spiritually and considering some of the things that we can look at as markers of, am I growing? Am I actually growing or pursuing growth? And you talked a little bit about how you can't really fake it till you make it. Growth happens internally and then reveals itself externally. You can't just pretend like you're growing because ultimately it'll be revealed. And you shared a great quote from Dallas Willard that I'd love for us to discuss and to hear from you on. Dallas Willard said, I ask myself these two questions. First, am I growing more or less easily irritated these days? And then I ask myself, am I growing more or less easily discouraged these days? So with those two things, those are revealing the fruit of our spirit. Am I growing more or less discouraged, more or less easily discouraged? Am I growing more or less easily irritated? What does that look like for you as you think through that?
Oh, to me, of course, I love Dallas Willard, but I love this question so much because it's one of those questions that we really can't dodge. We can talk so much about our religious performance and what we're doing for God and time we're spending in the Word, but ultimately, all of that is a means to an end. It's so that we have more of God, and more particularly, that He has more of us. And if He has more of us, then the character of Christ is being formed in us. And so these two questions are the kind of questions that really get to the core of who we are. Is my irritation on a daily basis getting worse or getting better, And my frustrations, these things, are they working out? Because it shows us where we really are. So I would really love for the groups to talk about this honestly, about where you find yourself and how these questions provoke you today. Because this will reveal the work God has yet to do in all of us.
So with that, it is this fruit of the Spirit of, I'm getting irritated. What is irritating me? Why is it irritating me? And is that the Spirit inside of me? Is that the fruit of irritation, of bitterness inside of me? So where are you wrestling with that? So we're going to put those last two questions up on the screen, and you can pause there and discuss. But also we want you to close by asking each other, how can you be praying for each other this week? Because we think it's so vital in community that you know that you're not alone. And when we intercede to the Father on behalf of someone else, it grows that community. It enhances our life to know someone's praying for you, but also see the fruit of that prayer. So maybe it's a prayer to overcome some irritation or bitterness or discouragement. Maybe it's a prayer to get through some hard things coming up. But share those and then make a commitment to pray for each other throughout this next week until we meet again. So we're going to pop up these last two questions. Are you growing more or less easily irritated these days? And are you growing more or less easily discouraged these days? Discuss that, seek some prayer together, and then have a great week. We'll see you back here next week.